It was in the warmth of late summer, when the air was thick with the scent of ripened grapes and the cicadas droned on in the afternoons, that I found myself standing at the edge of the life I thought I'd known. They say that sometimes the quietest places can be the ones that hold the most secrets, and our vineyard was no exception. It was meant to be a retreat, a place to come back to year after year, a sanctuary for Victor and me, woven with memories of family gatherings, laughter, and harvests that marked the passage of time. But Reed's arrival that summer was like a stone dropped into still water. I had always known of him, Victor's estranged son from his first marriage, a man with a quiet intensity that seemed to carry his past with him like a shadow. When he stepped onto the vineyard, his face framed by the dappled light filtering through the vines, I felt something shift, as if the air itself had thickened. At first, it was nothing more than polite conversation, late-night exchanges that drifted from one topic to another. He had a way of looking at me, an attentiveness that made me feel seen in ways I hadn't felt in years. And though I told myself it was just harmless talk, I knew, deep down, that something in me was stirring, something I couldn't ignore. Victor, of course, had his suspicions. He was a man who rarely missed details, and I could feel his gaze on me, the quiet way he watched our interactions, as if he were waiting for a crack in the foundation. He never spoke of it directly, but his questions lingered, subtle and sharp, a reminder that even in a place as isolated as our vineyard, secrets could be dangerous things. This isn't a love story, nor is it a simple tale of betrayal. It's a story about choices, about moments that seem small until you look back and realize they were the ones that changed everything. And as I stand here now, the echoes of that summer still lingering in the empty rooms of my mind, I wonder if I could have done anything differently, or if I was simply swept along by a force greater than myself. But I suppose that's the way with secrets. They grow in the dark, in the spaces between what is said and what is left unsaid. And once they take root, there's no turning back. The vineyard had always been Victor's pride, a sprawling estate tucked between the hills, where rows of vines stretched endlessly, as far as the eye could see. The land was a mixture of cultivated vines and untamed edges, where oak trees grew wild and tangled thickets bordered the paths. Each year, the vineyard came alive for harvest season, a time when family and friends gathered to celebrate the season's yield. I had grown accustomed to these gatherings, the way they blended tradition and festivity. But this year, things felt different. Victor, at 75, had become increasingly reliant on me to manage the smaller tasks around the estate. He liked to oversee everything, from the vineyards to the wine production, and he did it all with the precision of a man who had never known failure. He was charming in his own way, persuasive, and even in his retirement he kept a certain hold over the estate's day-to-day operations, a control he rarely let go of. This year, however, he'd invited Reed. I had only heard pieces of Reed's story over the years. A son from Victor's first marriage, a marriage that had crumbled long before I ever came into his life. Victor's bitterness toward his son had always been thinly veiled, a quiet resentment that colored the few times he'd mentioned him. To hear him tell it, Reed was a disappointment, someone who'd chosen a path that veered far from Victor's vision of a responsible, successful life. But when Reed arrived, he was nothing like the picture Victor had painted. He was tall, with an easy grace, his movements calm, as if he were accustomed to being on his own, comfortable in solitude. His clothes were simple, a worn shirt, jeans, boots that looked like they'd seen miles of road. There was a quietness to him, an intensity that suggested a life lived outside the boundaries of comfort and security. The first time he looked at me, his gaze lingered just a fraction too long, his expression thoughtful, curious, as though he were trying to place me within the landscape of his father's world. It was a look that made me feel exposed, seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. I could feel the pull of his presence, the way he seemed both familiar and foreign. A reminder of a time in my life that felt far away, yet somehow near. Over the next few days, Reed's presence became a part of the Vineyard's daily rhythm. He would wander through the rows of vines, sometimes disappearing for hours, only to reappear in the late afternoon, his face shaded with a thoughtful, far-off look. He had a way of drifting through the house, moving quietly, his presence a constant but unobtrusive reminder that he was watching, observing. Victor seemed both pleased and wary of his son's attention to the vineyard. He'd observe Reed from a distance, his gaze sharp, evaluating, as though he were sizing up a rival instead of his own son. Their conversations were brief, stilted exchanges that held an underlying tension. I could sense the gulf between them, a space filled with unspoken resentments and grievances that neither seemed willing to address. "So, you've taken an interest in the vineyard," Victor remarked one evening, as Reed joined us on the patio, where we often sat to enjoy the evening air. Reed shrugged, his gaze drifting over the rows of vines. "It's peaceful here," he replied, his tone non-committal. "I can see why you love it." Victor's expression softened, just for a moment, before it hardened again. A flicker of something close to pride, quickly masked by his usual guardedness. I watched them in silence, sensing the tension that simmered beneath their words, the unspoken history that hung in the air between them. And as I observed them, I felt a strange mixture of empathy and curiosity, a desire to understand the rift between them, to uncover the layers that had brought them to this quiet standoff. As the days went by, I found myself drawn to Reed, intrigued by his quietness, his introspective nature, that contrasted so sharply with Victor's controlled intensity. He was a man of few words, but there was a warmth in him, a gentleness that was unexpected, given the harsh picture Victor had painted. When he spoke, it was with a thoughtfulness that caught me off guard. A quiet intelligence that seemed to suggest he saw more than he let on. One afternoon, while Victor was in town handling some business, I found Reed in the library, absorbed in a book. I paused in the doorway, hesitant to disturb him, but he looked up and smiled, a soft, unassuming expression that made me feel unexpectedly shy. "Didn't mean to intrude," I said, stepping into the room. He shrugged, setting the book aside. "You're not intruding. I was just passing the time." There was a comfortable silence between us, the kind that felt natural, unforced. I sat down across from him, my gaze drifting to the shelves lined with books, most of them untouched, relics of a family history that felt distant, remote. I glanced at him, sensing his curiosity, his quiet attention that seemed to envelop me, making me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. "Do you come here often?" he asked, his tone casual, though I sensed a genuine interest behind the question. I nodded, feeling a faint smile tug at my lips. "I suppose it's become my refuge. This house, it can feel very large, very empty." He nodded, his gaze softening, and I felt a warmth spread through me, a sense of connection that was both exhilarating and unnerving. In that moment, I realized that he understood, that he saw the quiet loneliness that lingered beneath the surface of my life, the restlessness that I had tried to ignore. We spent the rest of the afternoon in quiet conversation, our words weaving a fragile connection that felt both thrilling and dangerous, a subtle intimacy that lingered even after he left the room. Victor, meanwhile, remained oblivious to the undercurrents that had begun to stir. He was preoccupied with the vineyard, the harvest, the endless details that demanded his attention. He moved through his days with a sense of purpose, a single-minded focus that left little room for anything beyond the immediate tasks at hand. To him, the vineyard was everything, a legacy he had built from the ground up, a testament to his vision and determination. But as he busied himself with the logistics of the harvest, I found myself slipping further into my connection with Reed, drawn to him in ways I couldn't fully understand or resist. There was something about him, a quiet confidence, a sense of self-assuredness that made me feel both vulnerable and alive, as though he were peeling back the layers I had so carefully constructed. One evening, as we walked through the vineyard at dusk, Reed turned to me, his gaze thoughtful. "Do you ever feel trapped here?" he asked, his voice soft, his words tinged with a quiet understanding. I looked at him, surprised by the question, by the way it seemed to echo my own thoughts, my own sense of entrapment that I had never dared to voice. "Sometimes," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. "But it's complicated." He nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips, and for a moment we simply stood there, the silence between us filled with unspoken words, a connection that felt both fragile and powerful, as though we were standing at the edge of something we couldn't yet name. From that moment on, our interactions took on a new intensity, a quiet charge that lingered in every glance, every accidental touch. We were careful, cautious, our conversations laced with a subtle tension that hinted at something more, something neither of us dared to acknowledge. But there was no denying the pull between us. The way he looked at me with a quiet curiosity, a warmth that made me feel alive, seen, desired. I knew it was dangerous, that I was walking a path that could only lead to ruin, but I couldn't pull myself away. His presence was intoxicating, a reminder of the life I had once dreamed of, a life filled with passion, spontaneity, connection. And as we moved through the days, our unspoken bond growing stronger, I realized that I was on the edge of something irreversible, a choice that would change everything. It started gradually, like an ember catching flame. At first, it was the smallest gestures, Reed brushing past me in the hall, the briefest touch of his hand against mine, each moment lingering a bit longer than it should have. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that I was imagining it, that I was simply responding to the loneliness that had been my companion for so many years. But with each passing day, I felt myself drawn further into his presence, pulled into an orbit that felt both thrilling and terrifying. Victor remained largely unaware, his days filled with the demands of the vineyard and the preparations for the harvest. I would watch him from a distance, his figure silhouetted against the rows of vines, his movements brisk, purposeful, as though he were chasing something only he could see. He had always been a man who needed a mission, a goal, and the vineyard had become his world, a place where he could pour all of his energy, his ambition. But while Victor was preoccupied with his vision, I found myself slipping further into Reed's world, a world that felt infinitely more real, more alive. We shared quiet moments in the library, conversations that drifted into the late hours of the night, our words weaving a fragile connection that grew stronger with each exchange. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the vineyard, Reed found me alone on the terrace, gazing out at the fields. He came to stand beside me, his presence a steady warmth that seemed to wrap around me, grounding me in the moment. "It's beautiful out here," he murmured, his voice soft, his gaze focused on the distant hills. I nodded, feeling my pulse quicken, the quiet intensity of his presence making it hard to think, hard to breathe. "It is," I replied, my voice barely a whisper, and as I turned to look at him, our eyes met, a silent understanding passing between us. Without a word, he reached for my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine in a gesture that felt both comforting and dangerous. We stood like that for a moment, the silence heavy with unspoken words, before he pulled me closer, his touch gentle, tentative, as though he were waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. Our first encounter was like a breath of fresh air, a release from the years of quiet resignation that had defined my life with Victor. It was something I hadn't expected, hadn't sought, but now that it was real, I couldn't bring myself to let it go. Reed awakened something in me, a sense of vitality, of passion, that I had thought long buried. But with that passion came guilt, a gnawing sense of betrayal that lingered at the edges of my mind, reminding me of the promises I had made, the life I had chosen. Each time I was with Reed, I felt the thrill of secrecy, the rush of desire, but it was always followed by a hollow ache, a reminder that I was treading on dangerous ground. We became masters of discretion, finding ways to meet without drawing attention, slipping away in the quiet hours of the morning or under the cover of night. There was a thrill in the secrecy, in the knowledge that we were walking a fine line, that we could be discovered at any moment. But that thrill was tempered by the fear, the constant awareness that one misstep, one wrong move, could unravel everything. As the days passed, the weight of our secret began to take its toll. I found myself lying awake at night, listening to Victor's steady breathing beside me, feeling the press of guilt settle over me like a shroud. I tried to tell myself that what I was doing was harmless, that it was simply a fleeting escape from the life I had built. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I was no longer just hiding an affair. I was hiding a part of myself, a part that I wasn't sure I could ever bring back into the light. One afternoon, as I sat alone in the garden, Reed found me, his presence a quiet reassurance that I clung to in the stillness. He sat beside me, his gaze thoughtful, his expression soft as he reached for my hand, his touch a steady comfort that seemed to ground me, to hold me in place. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with a tenderness that took me by surprise. I looked at him, my heart aching with the weight of my emotions, the conflicting desires that had driven me to this point. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. "I feel trapped, like I'm caught between two lives, two worlds." He nodded, his expression somber, and for a moment we simply sat there, the silence between us filled with unspoken words, a connection that felt both comforting and bittersweet. I wanted to tell him everything, to unburden myself, but the words wouldn't come, caught somewhere between fear and desire, between loyalty and longing. As the weeks went by, our encounters grew bolder, our moments together filled with an urgency that left me breathless, exhilarated. We would steal kisses in the quiet corners of the vineyard, our touches lingering just a moment too long, each encounter a reminder of the passion that had taken root between us. But with each passing day, the weight of our secret grew heavier. Victor's gaze began to linger, his questions more pointed, his presence a constant reminder that we were walking a dangerous line. He would watch me, his expression thoughtful, as though he were piecing together a puzzle, searching for cracks in the foundation. One evening as we sat together at dinner, he looked at me, his gaze sharp, his voice calm as he asked, "Isadora, you seem different lately, distracted." The question caught me off guard, and for a moment I felt my heart stop, my mind racing as I searched for an answer, a way to deflect his suspicion. I forced a smile, keeping my voice steady as I replied, "It's just the season, Victor. The vineyard, the harvest, it's a lot to manage." He nodded, his expression unreadable, but I could sense the tension between us, the unspoken questions that lingered in the air, a reminder that our secret was not as hidden as I had thought. One evening, as Reed and I walked along the edge of the vineyard, he turned to me, his gaze thoughtful, a hint of something vulnerable in his expression. "We don't have to keep hiding," he murmured, his voice soft but steady. "We could leave, Isadora, start fresh, somewhere else." The suggestion sent a thrill through me, a tantalizing glimpse of freedom, of a life unfettered by secrets and lies. But even as I allowed myself to imagine it, to picture a life with him beyond the vineyard, I knew it was impossible. I was bound to this life, to the choices I had made, and the thought of leaving it all behind felt as frightening as it did exhilarating. "I can't," I whispered, my voice trembling with the weight of the truth. I'm not brave enough." He nodded, a faint sadness in his eyes, but he didn't press me, didn't try to change my mind. Instead, he pulled me into his arms, holding me close, his touch a quiet reassurance that, for now, we had this. This moment, this fleeting escape from the world that waited just beyond the vines. The days that followed our conversation about leaving were a blur of secrecy and tension. Reed had suggested a future that felt both thrilling and impossible, and his words lingered in my mind, a tantalizing promise of freedom that I could never fully allow myself to believe. But as much as I wanted to escape, to leave behind the weight of my choices, I knew I was bound to this life, to Victor, by the threads of loyalty and the life we had built together. Victor, meanwhile, was growing more perceptive, his gaze sharper, his questions more pointed. He had always been an observant man, one who rarely missed details, and I could sense that he was piecing something together, that he was watching me with a careful, calculating eye. His presence was like a shadow, a constant reminder that our secret was hanging by a thread, ready to unravel at any moment. One evening, as we were preparing for a gathering at the Vineyard, Victor stopped me in the kitchen, his gaze steady, his voice calm but with an edge that set me on alert. "Isadora, you've been distant lately," he said, his tone measured, as though he were trying to coax a confession from me. "Is everything all right?" I forced a smile, trying to keep my voice light, casual. "Of course, Victor. I've just been preoccupied with the Vineyard, the preparations. There's a lot to manage." He nodded, though I could see the skepticism in his eyes, a flicker of doubt that made my heart race. I knew he didn't fully believe me, that he was watching me closely, waiting for the slightest crack, the smallest sign that would confirm his suspicions. And as I looked at him, feeling the weight of his gaze, I realized that our secret was no longer just a risk. It was a ticking time bomb, waiting to explode. The following afternoon, as I was organizing the library, I came across a folder tucked between the shelves. I almost ignored it, thinking it was another one of Victor's old property documents or invoices. But something about the way it was hidden, just slightly out of sight, caught my attention. I opened it, feeling a chill settle over me as I read the contents. Inside were a series of letters, financial statements, and legal documents, detailing a series of debts and payments made to various creditors. Each document bore Reed's name, along with mentions of past disputes and demands for repayment. There was even a note from a debt collector, the language firm, demanding immediate payment on an outstanding balance. My heart sank as I absorbed the implications, the questions that began to surface, each one sharper, more alarming than the last. Had Reed come to the Vineyard because of these debts? Was he using me, manipulating our connection to escape his past? I felt a sense of betrayal, an ache that went deeper than I'd expected, and I realized that I had been blind, caught up in a fantasy, in a vision of Reed that I had constructed for my own loneliness and desires. That evening, when I saw Reed in the garden, I couldn't hold back the questions that had been swirling in my mind. "Why didn't you tell me, Reed?" I whispered, my voice tight, my heart pounding with the weight of my suspicions. "About the debts, the trouble." He looked at me, his expression caught between guilt and defensiveness, as though he had been dreading this moment. "I didn't want you to know," he replied, his voice low, resigned. "I wanted to leave all of that behind, to start over." I felt a pang of sadness, a sense of loss, as though the illusion I had clung to was slipping away, revealing a truth I wasn't ready to face. I wanted to believe him, to trust that what we shared was real, but the doubts lingered, casting shadows over our connection, a reminder that our love had been built on secrets, on lies that could no longer be ignored. In the days that followed, Victor's suspicion grew sharper, his questions more pointed. I could feel his gaze on me whenever we were together, his eyes narrowing as he observed my every move, his silence filled with an intensity that left me on edge. He was a man who rarely confronted issues directly, preferring instead to watch, to analyze, to let others reveal their secrets through their own actions. One evening, as we were hosting a gathering at the Vineyard, Victor caught me in a quiet moment, his gaze sharp, his tone edged with accusation. "Isadora, I can't shake the feeling that something is off between us," he said, his voice low, his words laced with a tension that made my pulse quicken. "Is there something you're not telling me?" I looked at him, my heart pounding, the weight of my guilt pressing down on me, suffocating me. I wanted to deny it, to reassure him, but the words wouldn't come, caught somewhere between my guilt and my loyalty to Reed. "I'm just tired, Victor," I replied, my voice trembling, the lie feeling heavy on my tongue. "It's been a long season, and there's so much to manage." He nodded, though his expression remained skeptical, his gaze lingering on me, as though he were searching for the truth, a confirmation of the suspicions that had taken root in his mind. Victor's suspicion cast a shadow over everything, a constant reminder of the risk we were taking, the danger that lurked beneath our carefully constructed facade. I could feel my nerves fraying, my emotions stretched thin as I navigated the tension between my love for Reed and the life I had built with Victor. A life that felt increasingly fragile, as though it could crumble at any moment. One afternoon, as I was tending to some tasks in the vineyard, Silas, the vineyard manager and an old friend of Victor's, approached me, his expression thoughtful, his gaze lingering just a bit too long. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Grant?" he asked, his tone polite but laced with an undertone of concern. I forced a smile, trying to keep my voice steady. "Of course, Silas, why wouldn't it be?" He nodded, though his expression remained unconvinced, a flicker of doubt in his eyes that sent a chill down my spine. I knew that Silas had known Victor for years, that he was perceptive, observant, the kind of man who rarely missed details. And as he walked away, I felt a pang of fear, a sense of dread that gnawed at me, a reminder that our secret was no longer just ours to keep. The weight of our secret, the guilt and the fear, finally became too much to bear. One evening, as I met Reed by the lake, the sunset casting a warm glow over the water, I confronted him, my voice filled with a desperation I could no longer contain. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," I whispered, my voice trembling as I looked at him, my heart aching with the weight of my emotions. This secret, this lie, it's consuming me." He looked at me, his expression softening, a flicker of regret in his eyes. "I never meant to hurt you, Isadora," he murmured, reaching for my hand, his touch a steady comfort in the darkness. I needed you. I still do." His words sent a pang of sadness through me, a reminder of the love we had shared, the passion that had bound us together in a way that felt both beautiful and destructive. I wanted to hold on to him, to believe that we could make this work, but the doubts lingered, the questions that had haunted me since I had uncovered his secrets. And as we stood there, the silence heavy with unspoken words, I realized that we were standing at a crossroads, that the choices we had made had led us to a place where there was no turning back. The evening Victor confronted me, the vineyard was cloaked in a heavy silence, as though even the land itself sensed the weight of what was to come. The sun had slipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of indigo and deep violet, the colors darkening with each passing moment. I was in the kitchen, washing dishes and trying to calm the restless energy that had filled me, when I heard Victor's footsteps approach, steady and deliberate. "Isadora," he called, his voice firm, a tone he rarely used unless he meant to address something serious. I dried my hands, bracing myself as I turned to face him. He stood in the doorway, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed on me with an intensity that made my heart pound. "We need to talk," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. I nodded, swallowing hard, feeling the weight of our secrets pressing down on me, suffocating me. I had known this moment was coming, that our carefully constructed lies would eventually unravel. But now that it was here, I felt a terror I hadn't expected. A fear not just of discovery, but of losing everything I had ever known. Victor led me to the sitting room, where he motioned for me to sit. He remained standing, his gaze never wavering, his expression a mask of calm that was somehow more unsettling than any outburst could have been. "Is there something you want to tell me, Isadora?" he asked, his voice low, controlled but laced with an edge that sent a chill down my spine. I opened my mouth, searching for words, for some way to explain, to soften the truth, but the silence stretched between us, heavy and unforgiving. "I know about you and Reed," he said finally, his words like a blow, each one hitting me with a force that left me breathless. "I've known for some time. I was just waiting for you to have the decency to tell me yourself." I felt the blood drain from my face, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing down as I struggled to breathe, to find some way to explain what I couldn't even fully understand myself. "Victor," I began, but he cut me off, his gaze hardening. "Spare me the excuses, Isadora," he said, his voice sharp, each word laced with a bitterness that sliced through me. "I trusted you. I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me?" His words hit like a physical blow, the weight of my guilt settling over me like a shroud. I wanted to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, but I knew it was too late, that nothing I could say would undo the damage I had done. "I never meant for it to happen," I whispered, my voice trembling. "It was a mistake, a moment of weakness." But even as I spoke, the words felt hollow, empty. A feeble attempt to rationalize something that had shattered our lives beyond repair. Victor's gaze remained steady, his expression unreadable, and I could feel the depth of his anger, the betrayal that had taken root in his heart, a wound that would never fully heal. "I don't care about your excuses, Isadora," he said finally, his voice cold. "I want him gone, and after that, I'm not sure I want you here either." Later that night, I found Reed by the edge of the lake, his figure silhouetted against the darkening sky. He turned when he saw me approaching, his expression softening, though I could see the tension in his posture, the wariness in his gaze. "He knows, Reed," I said, my voice barely a whisper, the words hanging in the air between us, a final, irrevocable truth. He nodded, a resigned look crossing his face. I figured it was only a matter of time. There was a silence between us, heavy and thick, each of us caught in our own thoughts, our own regrets. I looked at him, feeling a mixture of sadness and frustration, a sense of loss for the life we could have had, for the love that had been tainted by lies and secrets. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice trembling, the weight of the question settling over me, filling me with a dread that was almost palpable. He looked away, his gaze distant, his shoulders slumping. "I don't know," he replied, his voice filled with a quiet resignation. "I never wanted to hurt you, Isadora. I just didn't know how to walk away." His words hit me with a mixture of sorrow and anger, a reminder of the choices we had made, the decisions that had led us to this moment. I wanted to forgive him, to hold on to the love we had shared, but the doubts lingered, the questions that had haunted me since I had discovered his secrets. "You should go," I whispered finally, the words catching in my throat, each one a painful reminder of the life we had lost. "There's nothing left for us here." He nodded, a flicker of sadness in his eyes, and for a moment I thought he might argue, might try to convince me to leave with him. But he simply turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the night, leaving me alone in the silence, with nothing but the memories of what once was. The days that followed were filled with an emptiness I had never known, a hollow ache that settled in my chest, a reminder of the life I had shattered, the love I had lost. Victor and I existed in a state of silent animosity, moving through the house like strangers, each of us caught in our own grief, our own resentment. He rarely spoke to me, his gaze distant, his expression unreadable. It was as though he had erased me from his life, as though the years we had spent together were nothing more than a memory, a shadow that he was determined to forget. One evening, As we sat across from each other at dinner, Victor looked at me, his gaze filled with a cold determination that sent a chill down my spine. "I've spoken with my lawyer," he said, his voice calm, though his words were laced with a quiet fury. "I want you out of this house by the end of the month." The words hit me like a physical blow, the finality of his decision settling over me, filling me with a sense of loss that was almost unbearable. I wanted to argue, to plead with him, but I knew it was pointless, that there was no forgiveness left in him. No way to repair the damage that had been done. And as I looked at him, feeling the weight of his anger, his betrayal, I realized that I was truly alone, that the life I had known was gone, lost to the choices I had made, to the secrets that had torn us apart. The morning I left the vineyard was quiet, the air still, the silence heavy with a sense of finality. I packed my belongings, the fragments of a life that felt distant, foreign, as though it had belonged to someone else. Victor didn't come to see me off. He remained inside, a silent reminder of the love that had once been ours, now shattered beyond repair. As I drove away, the vineyard receding in the distance, I felt a strange sense of relief, a lightness that I hadn't expected. I had lost everything, my love, my home, the life I had built with Victor. But in that loss, there was a quiet freedom, a release from the secrets that had haunted me, the lies that had torn my life apart. And as I looked back one last time, the vineyard fading from view, I felt a bittersweet sense of closure, a quiet acceptance of the choices I had made, the life I had left behind. The weeks that followed my departure from the vineyard were filled with a strange, quiet emptiness. The world felt both familiar and foreign, as though I were drifting between two lives, the one I had left behind and the one I was slowly learning to navigate alone. At first, each day was a reminder of what I had lost, a series of moments filled with regret, with the echoes of choices I could never take back. I moved to a small town by the coast, renting a modest cottage nestled at the edge of a windswept cliff, the ocean stretching endlessly before me. It was a place far removed from the vineyard, from the life I had known with Victor. And in its quiet simplicity, I found a sense of solace, a chance to rebuild in the shadow of everything I had left behind. Sometimes, on stormy nights, I would walk along the cliffs, the wind whipping around me, the waves crashing against the rocks below, each one a reminder of the tumultuous path I had traveled. I would think back to those days with Reed, the moments we had stolen, the passion that had burned so brightly before it turned to ashes. And though there was a sadness in those memories, a deep ache for what might have been, there was also a quiet acceptance, a recognition that I had loved and lost, and that in some ways that love had set me free. As the weeks turned into months, I found myself reflecting on the choices I had made, on the life I had built with Victor, and the secrets that had ultimately torn us apart. I had loved him once, in a way that was steady and unwavering, a love that had felt as solid as the land we had tended together. But over time that love had grown quiet, settling into a rhythm that left little room for passion, for the kind of connection I had once dreamed of. And then Reed had arrived, bringing with him a sense of excitement, a reminder of a life I had thought long buried. He had awakened something in me, a desire for freedom, for adventure, for a connection that felt real, alive. I had given in to that desire, knowing full well the risk, the price I would ultimately pay. And though I had lost everything, I couldn't bring myself to regret it entirely. There was a strange kind of strength in accepting my choices, in facing the consequences and moving forward. I had betrayed Victor, shattered the life we had built together. And yet, in the ashes of what once was, I had found a resilience I hadn't known I possessed. A quiet resolve to forge a new path, to reclaim a sense of self that had been lost in the shadows of my past. In time, the ache of loss began to fade, replaced by a gentle peace, a sense of quiet that settled over me like a balm. I found a rhythm in the solitude, a sense of purpose in the small, simple tasks of everyday life. I began painting again, capturing the beauty of the coastline, the ever-changing colors of the ocean, the way the light danced across the waves. Each brushstroke was a release, a way of letting go, of unburdening myself from the weight of the past. People in town would sometimes ask me about my life, about where I had come from, but I kept my answers vague, offering only fragments of a story that had once defined me. I wasn't the same woman who had arrived at the Vineyard all those years ago, the wife who had stood beside Victor, content in the role she had chosen. I was something else now, someone forged in the fire of love and loss, someone who had faced the depths of her own soul and emerged changed, scarred but whole. And as I moved through each day, as the memories faded and the pain softened, I found a sense of gratitude for the life I had lived, for the love I had known, even if it had been fleeting. I had loved deeply, fiercely, and though it had cost me everything, it had also set me free, allowing me to step into a life that was truly my own. Now, as I stand here, looking out over the ocean, the waves rolling in a steady rhythm, I feel a quiet resolve, a peace that comes from accepting the choices that have led me here. I am no longer haunted by the ghosts of my past, by the regrets and what-ifs that once filled my mind. I have found a freedom in the solitude, a strength in the quiet that surrounds me, and for the first time in years, I feel whole, complete, in a way that I never thought possible. I may never know if Reed found the life he was searching for, if he ever discovered the peace he had been seeking in our time together. And I may never see Victor again, may never find the forgiveness I once craved. But I know now that I don't need it, that I am enough on my own, that the life I have built in the wake of everything I have lost is one that belongs to me and me alone. And as the sun sets over the water, casting the world in hues of gold and crimson, I find myself smiling, a quiet, bittersweet smile, as I turn away from the past and face the future, ready to embrace whatever lies ahead. It was a sunny Tuesday afternoon when it all began. The light filtered through the lace curtains of my living room, scattering patterns across the coffee table where I'd carelessly left a book I now regret placing so brazenly in plain sight. The cover was striking, crimson letters spelling out a title that left little to the imagination. Desires of the Middle-Aged Heart. I was in the kitchen preparing tea when Julian walked in. He wasn't supposed to be home. College classes usually kept him out until late evening, but there he was, tall and lean, with that boyish curiosity that always made him look younger than his 21 years. He paused by the table, his gaze locking onto the book. I caught the moment from the corner of my eye, his brow furrowing in surprise before one of his lips curled upward in what could only be described as a smirk. "Interesting choice," he remarked, holding up the book. His tone was casual, but his eyes flickered with amusement. Or was it something else? I felt heat creep up my neck. "It's research," I lied, turning to face him. "I'm editing it for a client." "Really?" He flipped through the pages, skimming a paragraph before closing it with a deliberate snap. "Looks more like inspiration than research." I laughed, though it came out too forced to be convincing. "Don't judge a book by its cover." But his smile lingered, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was judging much more than the book. He set it back down, his fingers brushing against the table for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, before walking away with that same smirk. As the door to his room clicked shut, I exhaled, trying to steady the unease bubbling in my chest. It wasn't the book itself that bothered me. It was how he looked at it. At me. Like he saw something I wasn't ready to acknowledge. That moment marked the beginning of something I never anticipated. Something I couldn't have stopped even if I'd tried. Looking back, I wonder if I left the book there on purpose. If some part of me wanted him to find it, to look at me in a way that no one else had in years. My days had fallen into a predictable rhythm. Mornings started with a steaming cup of coffee, followed by hours spent hunched over manuscripts. my red pen circling errors and suggesting improvements. Being a freelance book editor had its perks. Flexibility, solitude, but it also left me craving something I hadn't quite been able to name. Perhaps that's why I'd been so careless with the book that Tuesday. Julian had moved back in a few months earlier. He needed a place to stay while finishing his final year of college, and I couldn't refuse. It was a big house, far too empty since Charles, my late husband, passed away. I told myself it was nice having someone around again, even if Julian and I had never been particularly close. Our interactions were polite but sparse. He was often buried in his coursework or out with friends. I gave him space, and he returned the favor. But after the book incident, something shifted. The following morning, as I sat at the dining table editing a particularly dull manuscript about corporate leadership, Julian walked in. He was wearing sweatpants and a t-shirt, his hair still messy from sleep. I barely glanced up, expecting the usual quick grab of cereal before he disappeared. Instead, he lingered. "About that book," he started, leaning casually against the counter. I froze, my pen hovering over the page. "What about it?" He shrugged, but his eyes betrayed a spark of curiosity. "I looked it up. Seems different from the stuff you usually work on." I sighed, setting the pen down. "Not every project can be thrilling, Julian. It's just another job. Right?" He nodded, but didn't leave. Instead, he poured himself a cup of coffee and sat across from me. "So what's it about?" I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. "It's a novel about relationships, exploring connections later in life." "Relationships, huh?" He smirked, and I felt my cheeks flush. "Yes," I replied sharply, hoping to end the conversation. But Julian didn't seem deterred. "You know," he said after a long sip of coffee, "I think people underestimate how complex relationships can be at any age." His tone was casual, but there was something in the way he spoke that made my stomach twist. I forced a smile, brushing off his comment as a passing observation, but as the days went on, I noticed him watching me more closely. One evening, I caught him in the living room. He was sprawled out on the couch with his laptop, but on the coffee table sat my book. He wasn't reading it, but its presence there felt deliberate, like a silent challenge. "Are you enjoying my things now too?" I asked, half joking as I entered the room. He glanced up, unbothered. "Just curious, you left it out again." I crossed my arms. "It's not exactly your type of reading material. Maybe I'm expanding my horizons." His eyes met mine, and for a brief moment, the room felt too small. I tried to laugh it off, muttering something about him needing to expand his horizons elsewhere, but the tension didn't dissipate. If anything, it lingered, growing heavier with each passing interaction. By the end of the week, I started catching myself thinking about Julian at odd moments. It wasn't just the way he looked, though he was undeniably handsome with his sharp features and confident posture. It was his sudden attentiveness, the way he seemed to notice things no one else did. Like the day he commented on my hair. I'd spent a little extra time brushing it out, hoping to feel less invisible. "Your hair looks nice like that," he said as he passed me in the hallway. It was a simple remark, but it caught me off guard. "Thank you," I replied, my voice quieter than I intended. These moments were small, insignificant on the surface, but they piled up like drops of water filling a glass. I told myself it was nothing, that I was overthinking. But deep down, I knew something had shifted between us. The household wasn't as quiet as it used to be, and it wasn't just because Julian was home. It was the unspoken words, the lingering glances, and the way my pulse quickened when I caught his eye. It was late one evening when I found Julian in the living room again. The house was quiet, the only sound the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I had been working in my study but decided to stretch my legs and get a glass of water. Passing by, I saw the glow of a lamp illuminating his face as he sat on the couch, the book open in his hands. For a moment, I froze in the doorway, my breath catching. He hadn't just been flipping through the pages. He was reading it, his brow furrowed in concentration. I could see the slight movement of his lips as he silently mouthed the words, an unconscious habit he'd had since he was a boy. "Interesting bedtime story?" I asked, leaning against the frame, trying to sound nonchalant. He looked up, startled but quickly recovered. "It's different," he admitted, closing the book but keeping his thumb between the pages. "A lot more honest than I expected." "Honest?" I raised an eyebrow. Stepping into the room, he nodded. Yeah, it's raw. About love, attraction, all the messy parts people don't talk about. I sat down in the armchair across from him, crossing my legs and pretending his words didn't stir something inside me. That's the point of good writing, Julian, to explore the things people are too afraid to say out loud. And you're comfortable with all of this? His eyes locked on mine, his tone probing. I hesitated. It's not about comfort, it's about understanding perspectives, even if they make you uncomfortable. For a moment he said nothing, his gaze steady. Then, almost casually, he asked, "Do you think people can feel that kind of passion at any age?" I was taken aback, unsure of how to answer. I think passion doesn't have an expiration date. Why do you ask? He shrugged, but there was something deliberate about his nonchalance. Just curious. It's not something people my age think about much. You'd be surprised, I murmured, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Our eyes met again, and the air between us seemed to shift, charged with something unspoken. I quickly stood, brushing imaginary lint off my sweater. Don't stay up too late. You've got class in the morning. Good night, Eleanor, he said softly, his voice carrying a weight that followed me down the hallway. The next day, I found myself replaying our conversation, dissecting his words and their possible meanings. Was he simply curious, or was there something deeper lurking beneath his questions? That evening, as I sat at my desk trying to focus on a manuscript, I heard a knock at the door. Julian stepped in, holding 2 mugs of tea. I figured you could use a break, he said, setting one down beside me. Thanks, I said, surprised. He lingered, his hands in his pockets. Can I ask you something? I nodded cautiously. That book. Why did you decide to work on it? I mean, you could have passed it off to someone else, right? I hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. It's personal, I guess. Not the content, but the idea of it. I think people deserve to see themselves reflected in stories no matter their age. That makes sense, he said, pulling out a chair and sitting across from me. But does that mean you see yourself in it? His question caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. I think everyone can relate to some part of it, I said carefully. He didn't press further, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't satisfied with my answer. Over the next week, Julian's curiosity only grew. He started asking me questions about other books I'd worked on, about my thoughts on love and relationships. At first, I chalked it up to his inquisitive nature, but as his questions became more pointed, I couldn't ignore the undercurrent of something more. One afternoon, I caught him staring at me while I was reading on the patio. He was supposed to be studying, but his textbook lay forgotten on his lap. When I looked up, he didn't look away. You're distracted, I said, trying to keep my tone light. Maybe, he admitted, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Is something on your mind? He hesitated before answering. Do you ever think about starting over? Finding someone new? The question was so unexpected that I didn't know how to respond. That's complicated, I said finally. Life usually is, he replied, standing and heading inside before I could say anything more. As the days passed, I found myself increasingly aware of Julian's presence. His questions, his glances, the way he seemed to hang on my every word. It was as if he was peeling back layers I hadn't realized were there. And I couldn't deny it. I didn't hate the attention. The air had been charged between us for days now, though neither of us acknowledged it outright. The unspoken tension lingered like a static current in the house, growing stronger with every shared glance and stolen moment. That Saturday, I decided to tackle some long-overdue organizing in the library. Books were scattered across the shelves, a chaotic mixture of old novels, college textbooks, and various anthologies I'd collected over the years. I had just finished sorting a stack when Julian walked in, barefoot and casual in jeans and a gray t-shirt. Need a hand? He offered, his tone light. Sure, I said, brushing a strand of hair from my face. But I'm warning you, this is a full-day project. I've got time, he replied, stepping closer. We worked side by side for hours, exchanging easy conversation about everything from his classes to my editing projects. The tension that had clouded the air earlier seemed to dissolve as we focused on the task at hand. It felt almost normal, the kind of comfortable interaction I'd long since stopped expecting. But that comfort didn't last. As I reached for a book on the top shelf, Julian stepped forward to help. His hand brushed against mine, lingering longer than necessary. The warmth of his skin sent a jolt through me, and I pulled back as if burned, clutching the book to my chest. "Sorry," he murmured, though his voice was soft, almost tender. "It's fine," I said quickly, turning away to hide the flush spreading across my cheeks. But it wasn't fine. That brief touch had awakened something I'd been trying desperately to ignore. My heart raced, my skin tingled, and every nerve in my body seemed to come alive in a way it hadn't in years. After that moment, things changed. Julian became more attentive, finding reasons to be near me. He offered to help with chores, brought me coffee in the mornings, and lingered in the kitchen while I cooked. His presence was both comforting and unnerving, and I couldn't tell if it was intentional or if I was imagining it. One evening, I found him in the living room, sketching in a notebook. "I didn't know you drew," I said, sitting on the arm of the couch. "It's just a hobby," he replied, turning the page so I couldn't see. "Let me look," I teased, reaching for the notebook. He hesitated but handed it over, his expression unreadable. The drawings were beautiful. Portraits, landscapes, moments captured in delicate lines and shadows. But one sketch made me pause. It was a woman, her back turned, hair cascading down her shoulders. "It's stunning," I said, running my fingers over the edge of the paper. "It's you," he said quietly. I looked up, my breath catching. "Me?" He nodded, his eyes meeting mine. "I've been drawing you for weeks. You're inspiring." The room felt smaller, the air heavier. I handed the notebook back, unsure of what to say. "Thank you," I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotion. I couldn't stop thinking about him. His touch, his words, the way he looked at me as if I were the only thing that mattered. It was intoxicating and terrifying all at once. One afternoon, I decided to confront him, to put an end to whatever was happening before it spiraled further out of control. I found him in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with a glass of water in hand. "Julian, we need to talk," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. "Okay," he said, setting the glass down and giving me his full attention. Whatever this is, it has to stop. It's not appropriate." He frowned, his brows knitting together. "I don't understand. What are you talking about?" "You know exactly what I'm talking about," I said, my tone sharper than I intended. "The looks, the touches, the everything." He stepped closer, his expression softening. "Eleanor, I'm not doing anything you don't want." My breath hitched as he reached out, his fingers brushing a stray hair from my face. "If I'm wrong, tell me to stop," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. I should have pulled away, should have told him he was wrong, but I couldn't. My body betrayed me, leaning into his touch as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. "Julian," I began, but whatever protest I had died on my lips as his hand cupped my cheek. It was wrong. I knew it was wrong. But as his lips met mine, all the reasons why seemed to fade, replaced by a heat that consumed me. When I finally pulled away, my mind was a whirlwind of guilt and desire. "This can't happen again," I said, my voice trembling. "Why not?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. "Because it's not right." "Then why didn't you stop me?" I had no answer, no defense against the truth in his words. I turned and walked away, but even as I left the room, I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The tension in the house had reached a breaking point. Every glance, every accidental touch, every word exchanged between us seemed to carry more weight than it should. I avoided being alone with Julian as much as possible. But it didn't matter. His presence was everywhere, in my thoughts, my dreams, my waking moments. It was a rainy evening when the line was finally crossed. The sound of water pelting against the windows filled the silence as I sat in the kitchen, nursing a glass of wine after a frustrating day. My work had been rejected by a particularly difficult client, and the weight of it all was pressing down on me. I didn't hear Julian enter until he was already standing in the doorway. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft. I looked up, startled, but quickly composed myself. "I'm fine, just a rough day." He stepped inside, his socks muffling his footsteps. "Want to talk about it?" I shook my head, trying to avoid his gaze. "No, it's nothing." He didn't leave. Instead, he pulled out a chair and sat across from me, his eyes searching mine. "You've been distant," he said after a moment. "I've been busy," I replied, though even I could hear the lie in my voice. "Eleanor," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "Talk to me. I sighed, leaning back in my chair. It's complicated, Julian. Work, life, everything feels so heavy lately. He reached out, his hand covering mine. You don't have to carry it alone. His touch was warm, grounding, and for a moment I allowed myself to lean into it. I've been carrying things alone for a long time, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. You don't have to anymore, he said, his thumb brushing against my knuckles. The words hung between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. I looked up at him, and for the first time, I let myself see him, not as my stepson, but as the man he had become. Julian, I began, but he interrupted me, his voice low and steady. Tell me to leave, and I will, but if you don't want me to. He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't have to. The choice was mine, and I knew what I wanted, what I'd wanted for weeks but had been too afraid to admit. I didn't tell him to leave. The first kiss was hesitant, a soft meeting of lips that sent a shiver down my spine. I pulled back, searching his eyes for doubt or hesitation, but there was none. He looked at me with a certainty that both terrified and thrilled me. When he kissed me again, it was deeper, more urgent. His hands found my waist, pulling me closer as the world outside seemed to fade away. My glass of wine tipped over, spilling red liquid across the table, but neither of us cared. We didn't make it to the bedroom that night. The kitchen became our sanctuary, our secret, as we gave in to the desire that had been building between us for so long. The next morning, I woke up in my own bed, the events of the night before, replaying in my mind like a dream. But it wasn't a dream. The lingering warmth on my skin, the faint scent of him on my pillow, they were all too real. I told myself it was a mistake, a moment of weakness that couldn't happen again. But when Julian walked into the kitchen, his hair damp from a shower and a small smile playing on his lips, I knew it wasn't that simple. Morning, he said, his tone casual. Morning, I replied, my voice wavering. He leaned against the counter, watching me with an intensity that made my pulse quicken. Are we going to talk about last night? There's nothing to talk about, I said quickly, turning my attention to the coffee pot. Eleanor. His voice was soft, but it carried a weight that made me stop. Don't pretend it didn't happen. I turned to face him, my arms crossed defensively. What do you want me to say, Julian? That it was a mistake? That it can't happen again? Was it a mistake? He asked, his eyes locking onto mine. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. I didn't know how to answer him, because deep down I knew it hadn't felt like a mistake. It had felt inevitable. Over the next few days, we danced around each other, caught in a limbo of desire and denial. Every touch, every glance, every accidental brush of skin only added fuel to the fire. One evening, as I worked late in my study, Julian appeared in the doorway. Can I come in? He asked. I nodded, unable to find my voice. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. I can't stop thinking about you, he admitted, his voice low and filled with emotion. Julian, we can't. Why not? He interrupted, stepping closer. Because it's wrong? Because you're afraid of what people will think? None of that matters to me, Eleanor. You matter. His words broke through my defenses, and before I could stop myself, I was in his arms again. This time there was no hesitation, no second-guessing. As the night stretched on, the boundaries we had once adhered to disappeared entirely. The days following that night blurred together into a haze of stolen moments and quiet longing. What had started as an impulsive decision, a kiss in the kitchen on a rainy evening, evolved into something neither of us could stop. Julian and I were drawn to each other like magnets, the pull too strong to resist, no matter how wrong it felt. We became masters of secrecy. Our relationship existed in the shadows, hidden behind locked doors and whispered conversations. When the house was empty, we'd find each other in the quiet corners, where no one could intrude. My office became our sanctuary, a place where we could exist without judgment, even for a little while. I'd sit at my desk, pretending to work, while Julian stood behind me, his hands resting lightly on my shoulders. Sometimes he'd lean down, his lips brushing against my neck, sending shivers down my spine. Other times he'd kneel beside me, his fingers tracing patterns on my arm as we talked about everything and nothing. One particularly warm afternoon, Julian suggested we go for a drive. Somewhere away from here, he said, his eyes bright with excitement. We ended up at a secluded park on the edge of town, where the trees formed a canopy of green above us. The world felt distant, almost unreal, as we walked hand in hand along the winding paths. "Does this feel strange to you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He stopped, turning to face me. "What do you mean?" "This," I gestured between us. "Us." He took a step closer, his hands finding mine. "It feels like the most real thing I've ever known." His words melted away my doubts. At least for the moment. We sat together on a wooden bench, the sound of birdsong filling the air as he wrapped his arm around my shoulders. I rested my head against him, letting myself believe, if only briefly, that this was normal. But as much as we tried to keep our affair hidden, cracks began to form in our carefully constructed facade. It started with Mrs. Harrington, our overly curious neighbor, who had an uncanny ability to appear at the most inconvenient times. One morning, as Julian left the house for class, she waved at him from her porch, a knowing smile on her face. "Julian seems to be around a lot more these days," she remarked later when I ran into her at the grocery store. "He's such a devoted stepson." Her words were innocuous, but the way she said them made my stomach churn. I smiled politely and changed the subject, but the encounter left me uneasy. Then there was Liam, Julian's best friend, who came over one evening to study. I stayed out of their way, retreating to my office, but I couldn't ignore the hushed conversation that floated through the walls. "You've been acting weird lately," Liam said. "Like, distracted." Julian's response was too quiet for me to hear, but whatever he said didn't seem to satisfy Liam. "You know you can tell me anything, right?" Liam pressed. "If there's something going on." Their conversation ended abruptly when I accidentally knocked over a stack of papers on my desk. A few minutes later, Julian appeared in my doorway, his expression unreadable. "Everything okay?" I asked, forcing a smile. "Yeah," he said, though his tone was tight. "Liam's just nosy." I didn't push further, but the tension in his voice lingered in the back of my mind. Our most daring encounter happened one evening when I was supposed to meet a client at the library. The meeting was canceled at the last minute, but I decided to stay and browse. The library had always been a refuge for me, a place where I could lose myself in the quiet comfort of books. I didn't expect Julian to show up. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice a mix of surprise and delight. "I was passing by," he said with a mischievous grin. "Thought I'd find you here." We wandered through the aisles together, our shoulders brushing as we pulled books from the shelves. In a quiet corner of the library hidden from view, he kissed me, his hands cupping my face as the world outside faded away. "This is crazy," I murmured against his lips. "Maybe," he said, his voice low. "But it's ours." As the weeks went on, the stakes grew higher. The more time we spent together, the harder it became to keep our feelings hidden. Julian didn't seem to care about the risks, but I couldn't ignore them. The fear of being discovered hung over me like a storm cloud, growing darker with each passing day. It wasn't just the fear of what others would think. It was the knowledge that this couldn't last. Julian was young, with his whole life ahead of him. I was not. The age difference between us was more than just a number. It was a chasm that I knew we couldn't bridge forever. But for now, I clung to the moments we shared, savoring them like stolen treasures. I told myself that I'd end it soon, that I'd find a way to let him go before it was too late. One evening, as we lay tangled together on the couch, Julian traced circles on my arm with his fingertips. "I don't want this to end," he said quietly. "Julian," I began, but he cut me off. "I mean it, Eleanor. I know it's complicated, but I don't care. I don't care about the rules or what people might think. I care about you." His words broke something inside me. I wanted to believe him, to let myself fall completely, but the voice of reason in my head wouldn't be silenced. "I care about you too," I admitted, my voice trembling. "But it's not sustainable, you know that." "We'll figure it out," he said, his tone filled with determination. I wanted to believe him, but deep down I knew the truth. Our affair was like a flame, intense, beautiful, but destined to burn out. The inevitability of discovery lingered in my mind like a shadow, but I had convinced myself we were careful enough to avoid it. It wasn't just the fear of others finding out that terrified me. It was the thought of what would happen to Julian, to us, once the delicate balance we'd maintained came crashing down. The first crack in our facade came during an unassuming afternoon. I was in the kitchen preparing lunch when Mrs. Harrington knocked on the door. She never visited unannounced, so her sudden appearance set my nerves on edge. "I was just dropping by to return your pie dish," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "And to check in on you. I've noticed Julian's car has been here a lot lately. I hope he's not giving you too much trouble." Her tone was casual, but her words carried an undertone that made my stomach tighten. "No trouble at all," I said, forcing a smile. "He's busy with school, but it's nice having him around." "Good," she replied, her gaze lingering on me for a moment too long before she handed me the dish and left. I closed the door, my heart pounding. She knew something. Maybe not the full truth, but enough to make me wary. Later that evening, Julian and I sat in the living room, the TV playing in the background. I told him about Mrs. Harrington's visit, trying to gauge his reaction. "She's just nosy," he said dismissively, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed his calm demeanor. "It's not just her, Julian," I said, lowering my voice. "People are starting to notice. We can't keep doing this." He turned to face me, his eyes filled with determination. "I don't care what people think, Eleanor. I care about you." His words were meant to reassure me, but they only heightened my anxiety. Things took a sharper turn when Julian's best friend, Liam, showed up unannounced one evening. I was in my study when I heard their voices in the living room, low and intense. "You've been acting weird, man," Liam said. "Like, really weird. What's going on?" "Nothing," Julian replied, but his tone was defensive. "Don't lie to me," Liam pressed. "Is it about Eleanor?" My breath caught. I stepped closer to the door, straining to hear. "What about her?" Julian asked, his voice steady but guarded. "I don't know," Liam said. "You just seem different when you're around her. It's like you're hiding something." Julian didn't respond, and the silence stretched on until Liam finally sighed. "If there's something going on, just be careful, okay? People talk." The real unraveling began when I received a job offer from a prestigious publishing house in another state. It was the kind of opportunity I had dreamed of for years, but accepting it would mean leaving everything behind, including Julian. When I told him about the offer, his reaction was immediate. "You're leaving?" he asked, his voice sharp with disbelief. "I haven't decided yet," I said, trying to keep my tone calm. "You're running away," he accused, standing and pacing the room. "Julian, this is my career," I said, struggling to make him understand. "I've worked so hard for this." "And what about us?" he demanded, his voice breaking. "There can't be an us," I said quietly. The words hung in the air like a knife between us. He stared at me, his expression a mixture of hurt and anger. In the days that followed, we barely spoke. The house felt colder, emptier, as the distance between us grew. I spent my nights poring over the details of the job offer, trying to convince myself it was the right choice. But one night, as I sat at my desk, Julian appeared in the doorway. "I'm not giving up on you," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his eyes. "Julian, please," I began, but he shook his head. "I don't care how complicated it is," he said. "I love you, Eleanor." The words hit me like a wave, overwhelming and undeniable. I wanted to tell him I loved him too, but the weight of our situation held me back. The breaking point came when I discovered that Mrs. Harrington had spoken to one of my clients during a chance encounter at the grocery store. "She mentioned something about your stepson living with you," my client said casually during a phone call. "She seemed curious about your dynamic." I hung up, my hands trembling. It was only a matter of time before the rumors spread further, before our secret became public knowledge. When Julian came home that evening, I told him everything. "We can't keep doing this," I said, my voice breaking. "It's too risky." "Eleanor, I don't care what people think," he said, his voice filled with desperation. "But I do," I replied, tears streaming down my face. For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. He stepped closer, his hands cupping my face as he whispered, "I can't lose you." "You never had me to begin with," I said, the words cutting deeper than I intended. The confrontation left us both shattered. Julian retreated to his room, and I spent the night staring at the ceiling, wondering how we'd let things go so far. By the time the sun rose, I had made my decision. The morning after my sleepless night, I resolved to put an end to everything. The affair, the secrecy, the moments that had made me feel alive for the first time in years. It all had to stop. The risk was too great, and the damage we'd cause, too profound. Julian emerged from his room just as I finished pouring myself a cup of coffee. His hair was disheveled, and the dark circles under his eyes mirrored my own exhaustion. "We need to talk," I said, setting the cup down. "I know," he replied, his voice subdued. We sat across from each other at the dining table, the weight of unspoken words heavy in the air. "This can't continue," I began, my hands trembling as I clasped them together. "It's not fair to you, and it's not fair to me." "Fair?" he echoed, his tone laced with frustration. "Since when has any of this been about fairness?" "Julian." "No, let me finish," he interrupted, his voice rising. "I know this isn't conventional. I know people wouldn't understand. But I don't care about them. I care about us." His words stirred something deep within me, a mixture of longing and regret, but I couldn't let myself be swayed. "There is no us," I said softly, my voice breaking. "This was a mistake." His expression shifted, the hurt in his eyes cutting me to the core. "You don't mean that," he said, his voice trembling. "I do," I lied, forcing the words out even as my heart screamed otherwise. "You need to move on, Julian. Find someone your age, someone who can give you the life you deserve." He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You don't get to decide what I deserve," he said, his voice sharp with anger. I watched helplessly as he stormed out of the house, the door slamming shut behind him. The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time in months, the house felt unbearably empty. I tried to focus on work, but my thoughts kept drifting to Julian, where he'd gone, what he was thinking, whether I'd made the right choice. Hours passed with no word from him. I resisted the urge to call, telling myself he needed time to process everything. But as night fell, my worry grew. Finally, just past midnight, the sound of the front door opening startled me from my restless thoughts. I rushed to the living room, relief flooding through me when I saw Julian standing there, his shoulders slumped and his expression weary. "Where have you been?" I demanded, unable to hide the concern in my voice. "Out," he replied curtly, avoiding my gaze. "Julian, I'm done talking," he said, cutting me off. "I get it, Eleanor. You don't want this. You don't want me." His words were like a dagger to my chest, but I didn't correct him. How could I, when I'd already made my decision? He walked past me, heading to his room without another word. The sound of his door closing was like the final nail in the coffin of whatever we'd shared. The next few days were agonizing. Julian barely spoke to me, and when he did, his words were clipped and distant. The house felt colder, emptier, as if the life had been drained from it. I threw myself into work, hoping it would distract me, but even that proved futile. My thoughts were consumed by memories of him, his touch, his smile, the way he'd looked at me as if I were the only thing that mattered. One evening, I received an unexpected phone call from the publishing house offering me the job. The editor on the other end was warm and enthusiastic, outlining the details of the position and emphasizing how much they were looking forward to having me on board. "It's a big opportunity," she said. "We hope you'll accept." I thanked her and promised to give them my decision soon, but as I hung up, the weight of the choice before me felt suffocating. That night, Julian confronted me. "I saw the email," he said, standing in the doorway of my study. "What email?" I asked, feigning ignorance. "The one about the job," he said, stepping inside. "You're taking it, aren't you?" I sighed, setting down my pen. "Julian, this isn't about you. Of course it's about me," he said, his voice rising. "You're running away because of what happened between us." "I'm taking the job because it's a good opportunity," I said firmly. "This has nothing to do with you." "Stop lying," he said, his tone raw with emotion. "You're scared, Eleanor. Scared of what people will think. Scared of how much you feel for me." His words hit too close to the truth, and I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "You're wrong," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" he challenged, stepping closer. "Tell me you don't feel anything for me. Tell me last night meant nothing." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. The silence stretched between us, heavy and oppressive. "I thought so," he said, his voice softening. "You can lie to yourself all you want, but you can't lie to me." Julian left the room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I stared at the email on my computer screen, the cursor blinking as if waiting for me to make a decision. I knew what I had to do. The day I left was gray and overcast, the kind of weather that made everything feel heavier. I had packed my things quietly, not wanting to disturb Julian. He had barely spoken to me since our last argument, and part of me hoped the silence was his way of letting me go. The publishing house had arranged for a moving service to help me settle into my new home. As I loaded the last box into the car, I paused, glancing back at the house. The memories of the past months played in my mind like a film reel. The laughter, the arguments, the stolen moments that had defined us. Julian appeared in the doorway, his hands shoved into his pockets. He looked tired, his usual confidence replaced by something softer, more vulnerable. "You're really going," he said, his voice flat. I nodded, unsure of what to say. "For what it's worth," he continued, stepping closer, "I don't regret any of it." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Neither do I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. We stood there for a moment, the weight of everything we couldn't say hanging between us. Finally, I reached out, my hand brushing against his. "Take care of yourself, Julian," I said, tears welling in my eyes. "You too," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. I wanted to say more, to tell him how much he had meant to me, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I got into the car and drove away, leaving behind the house, the memories, and the man I had fallen for. The weeks that followed were a blur of meetings, deadlines, and adjusting to my new life. The job was everything I had hoped for, challenging and fulfilling in ways I hadn't experienced in years. But no matter how busy I kept myself, I couldn't shake the emptiness that had settled in my chest. Every so often, I'd catch myself thinking about Julian, wondering what he was doing, if he was happy, if he thought of me as often as I thought of him. One evening, as I walked through the city, I passed by a bookstore. In the window was a display of novels, their colorful covers beckoning passers-by. My eyes landed on one title in particular, Desires of the Middle-Aged Heart. I couldn't help but smile, the memory of that fateful day flooding back. That book had been the catalyst, the spark that had ignited something neither of us could have anticipated. I stepped inside, running my fingers along the spines of the books as I wandered through the aisles. For a moment, I let myself imagine a different version of our story, one where the world wasn't so complicated, where we could have been together without fear or judgment. But life wasn't a storybook, and happy endings weren't guaranteed. As the months turned into years, I carried the memory of Julian with me like a keepsake tucked away in a drawer. I didn't dwell on it, but it never truly faded. It was a reminder of what it meant to feel alive, to take risks, to love without reservation, even when the odds were stacked against you. Looking back, I realized that what we had wasn't about right or wrong. It was about being human, flawed, vulnerable, and desperately searching for connection in a world that often felt too big and too cold. And though our time together was fleeting, it was real. It mattered.